He stood in front of the mirror in a suit that had belonged to him only yesterday. His hair, his posture, even his facial expression were all a little off. He knew it had to be that way. Today he was different. And yet, who exactly? At the bus stop, he smiled at a passerby. There was a third person in that smile. Not him of yesterday, not him of today, someone in between. He knew how to behave. He knew what words to say, how to pause. Was he taught, or did he come up with this behavior himself? The name he gave when asked wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. It was just another role. Like his walk, like his voice. He walked through the city as if it were a stage, where the scenery changed faster than he could think. Sometimes he felt something inside him slipping away. Moments where he wasn't acting, just being. But they were rare, like flashes of light in deep water. Everything else was acting, repeating, scene after scene. He remembered old conversations in which he said different words with a different voice. He saw photos of a person who looked like him, but wasn't him. And more often he thought, maybe there was never a single, authentic I. Maybe everything is a narrative, a plot in which a paragraph is added every day, but the author is also part of the fiction. He changed his clothes, manners, habits. Boundaries were erased. He became who he was called, who was needed, who happened to be. He created himself, but did not know why. In the evening, sitting by the window, he did not feel lonely. He simply looked at the city and knew, all this is part of history that continues to be written. And perhaps in this very changeability is the only truth. In the morning, he woke up in a room where the walls knew only today's version of him. The bed held the warmth of his body, but not his memory. He got up as if from a clean slate. No one demanded that he be the same, and he did not demand it of himself. He walked down the street, noticing how everyone he met invested a glance, an assessment, an expectation in him. And with each such glance, a new face was born in him. People created him as he created himself. He was a sum of reflections, sliding, changing, multiplying. In a cafe, he named his favorite drink, although he had not drunk it the day before. In a conversation, he repeated someone else's thought, but said it as if it were his truth. Listening to someone talk about him, he recognized himself, although before that he did not know that this was exactly who he was. He understood. Personality is not a sculpture but a river. It flows around, absorbs, washes away, and every day the water is new. But man continues to believe that it is still the same river. Sometimes, in the brief moments between events, he caught a strange feeling, as if someone was watching all of this, not judging, not explaining, just seeing, without a name, without a role. And in these moments, he felt quiet. He was no longer looking for the real me. He stopped calling them masks, because he realized there was nothing underneath. The masks were the face, all those names, gestures, looks, not lies, but layers of meaning, temporary, beautiful, fragile. When he smiled at the end of the day, it was a new smile, for no one, from no one, just a reflection of light in water that would never stop. Late at night, he sat on the roof, listening to the city breathe. The noise was steady, like a heart that is no longer surprised by change. Below him, windows, shadows, other people's lives moved. And inside him, a strange emptiness, but not frightening, a space in which one can breathe. He looked at the sky and didn't look for meaning in it. He no longer needed an explanation for why he felt different, why he was kind in one conversation, distant in another, unrecognizable even to himself in a third. It was all part of what he had come to accept, how the wind changed, how the night came without permission. He remembered the old name he had been called as a child. It echoed in his head, like an echo from another life. It didn't hurt. It was just strange, like hearing the voice of an actor playing a long-forgotten role. Once, he had believed that this name defined who he was. Now, it was just part of a phrase, no more significant than the others. More and more, he felt not the one who lives, but the one who observes, not a participant, but a silent witness of the change of roles. This witness had no form, no words. He did not need justification, explanation, image. And maybe this was what was real. He knew. Tomorrow he would become someone again. He would say the right phrases, play his part. People would see him as someone understandable, and he would continue to disappear between the lines, not getting lost, but dissolving, like the sun, not offended when clouds obscure it. He didn't want to be defined anymore. He wanted to be a flow, alive, real in that fluidity. Because in every eye he ever played, there was a spark, and in that spark, there was history, without beginning, without end, without the need to be one thing. He began to feel how easy it was to walk when you weren't holding on to any version of yourself, not justifying your actions, not building armor out of memories, just moving, living, not as a character, but as the breath between the lines. Sometimes he was asked questions. Who are you? How do you live? What do you want? He answered, but he knew. The answers are forms in the dust, disappearing in the first wind. Today they were like this, tomorrow, different. And this was not a deception, but honesty. Because a person who remains the same is not life, it is a pause. He no longer searched for depth in his own history. He did not try to dig into himself to find roots. He realized that perhaps there was no root in him, only branches, growing in different directions, touching different skies. He did not know where they led, but in this ignorance, there was trust. The people around him continued to play their roles. Some clung to the past, some built the future like a fortress. He looked at them with warmth, without feeling superior. He understood. Every path is part of a common dream, and there is no better or worse. There is only a step, and a trace that will soon disappear. Sometimes he felt his body move on its own, without commands. He spoke, and was surprised by the words. He laughed, and did not know where the laughter came from. Everything became light, as if someone had let go of the ropes that bound the stage. He did not seek enlightenment. He did not strive for meaning. He simply became transparent to himself. And in this transparency, suddenly there was a sense of presence. Someone who never played. Someone who does not appear in the mirror, but always looks from within. Without judgment, without history, without a name. And then he realized maybe everything he called himself was just a pattern on the water. And what was watching was silence. Not empty, but complete. Not explaining, but accepting. And in this acceptance, there was more life than in all his roles together. Morning came again without asking. Light filtered through the curtains like a thought that didn't require words. He opened his eyes, not to start the day, but simply to be. Without a task, without a plan, without the need to fit into someone else's expectations. He no longer caught himself thinking, "Am I right now?" He didn't compare. He didn't push. Just like water doesn't test its shape by passing through cracks. He didn't know who he would be today, and it stopped being an anxiety. It became a gift. In the cafe, he watched silently as people hurried after themselves, how each carried their own story, on their face, in their gait, in their voice, and each one was sure that it was them. He didn't argue with that. He just knew this wasn't the only way to be. He listened to the music and felt it pass through him, not touching, but reminding that he is not a fixed I, but a space in which everything appears and disappears. Thought, image, feeling, everything comes and goes, like the wind in a room without walls. He remembered the moments when he screamed, when he cried, when he hoped. All of it had happened. All of it was real, and all of it was gone. And there was no need to make a monument out of it. He no longer gathered himself into a fortress. He let himself go, like grains of sand in a river. He no longer sought silence, he became it. Not the absence of sound, but the space in which sound is free. He could speak, be silent, be bright or invisible. All these are not masks, but variations of breathing. He didn't know if this feeling would be permanent. He didn't hold on to it, because he realized that everything that can be held onto has already ceased to be alive. When the sun went behind the clouds, he didn't notice that it had become darker. Everything continued to be, not as a stage, but as the very possibility of being. At some point he noticed, the days were no longer divided into important and empty. Each of them was like a breath, not loud, not heroic, but necessary to continue. And in this ordinariness there was suddenly more reality than in all his previous aspirations. He walked down the street, and the glance of a random passerby did not make him want to be someone special. There was no need to please, to prove, to explain. He was, and that was enough. As if the air itself accepted him as he was, fickle, changing, alive. Sometimes the old thoughts would arise. Maybe he should have had a goal, a name, a plan. But they would pass like clouds. He didn't push them away, but he didn't cling to them either. He knew these thoughts were roles too. They could be played or let go. He stopped being afraid of being nobody. There was a strange lightness in this state, as if the weight that always seemed like part of the body had disappeared. He was an empty vessel, but it was in this emptiness that the world sounded, without distortion, without filters, without a script. In the subway, he saw a child looking out the window and talking to himself, without looking back, without trying to look like someone. Pure existence. And he smiled, not as an adult, not as an observer, but as someone who recognized himself in this child, before all the names, before all the attempts to become. When he closed his eyes before sleep, there was no summary of the day, no evaluation, only a soft feeling that everything that had happened was part of the dance, where he didn't know the movements, but the body moved itself, not for the sake of the audience, not for the sake of the goal, but because this was his truth. He became nobody, but in this nobody, he finally ceased to be a stranger to himself. Sometimes he thought he had disappeared, but not in a frightening way, more like the line between sea and sky disappears on a foggy day. He no longer felt sharply separated from the world. He was not an observer of life. He was it, not someone walking along the road, but the road itself. Passers-by could describe him, tall, silent, with a slightly absent gaze, but there was no substance behind this description. He no longer invested meaning in images. If someone called him kind, he accepted it. If indifferent, he accepted it too. No word built him anymore. He ceased to be made of words. He felt the need to win disappear, to explain, to defend himself. When someone argued, he listened, but did not argue back. Not out of weakness, but because there was no center to protect. Everything that had burned before now simply touched and went away. When he touched a tree, he didn't look for meaning, just warmth, texture, smell. When he walked in the rain, he didn't hide. Let it be wet. That's life too. He didn't look for comfort, but he didn't suffer either. He became like a leaf floating on water, not knowing where, but not resisting. He began to notice how the world spoke, not with words, with the movement of the wind, with the flicker of a glance, with the creak of feet. It all added up to a silence filled with life. He realized that you could exist without explaining yourself. Just be, not prove your presence. Just be there. And in this simple being, for the first time, he felt not loneliness, but complete fusion. He did not know what would happen tomorrow and did not want to know, because he understood everything that is needed is already here, in the breath, in the step, in the look, in the fact that he is, without a name, without history, without form. He was, and that turned out to be infinitely enough. The next day, he woke up the same way as always, not expecting revelations from the morning. The world was the same: the walls, the light, the sounds outside the window. But there was no longer the usual anxiety, as if something needed to be made up for, caught up with, proved. He did not look for reasons to start. He just started. He poured water into the cup and watched it fill, reflecting the flickering light. No symbolism, no deep thought, just this moment and him in it. Not an observer, not a thinker, not someone who makes sense. Just a part. He walked down the street, and every person passing by was like a guest from another dream. Each had their own dense history, their own struggle, their own walls. He did not feel alienated. He simply no longer wanted to break into other people's dreams as if they were his own. The desire to be understood, guessed, needed was gone. What remained was openness. When someone asked his name, he said it, not because he believed in it, but because it was convenient, like a key to a door that sometimes needed to be opened. But inside he knew, behind that name was not him. Behind the voice was not the voice. Behind the body was not the essence. He smiled more often, not because he was happy, but because there was nothing to stop him from smiling. His face became free, as if all the previous roles had released their grip. There was no longer a need to be serious, cheerful, important. He could be anything, and he was not stuck in any of the states. In the evening, he sat on the floor, in the dark. No thoughts, no techniques. He just sat, and that was enough. He felt his body slowly dissolving into space, his breathing becoming almost imperceptible, his consciousness ceasing to be the center. There was only silence, not around, but inside. And in that silence, there was no question. There was no "who am I?" There was no "why?" There was a soft, endless, accepting emptiness. And in it, everything. Everything he had ever sought, but could not name. He didn't find himself. He disappeared. And in this disappearance, presence finally happened. He began to notice how everything became easier when you didn't hold on to anything. When you weren't building a temple inside for your reflection, or moving memories from place to place, trying to find the real thing among them. Sometimes old feelings came. Guilt, fear, resentment. He no longer fought them. He did not drive them away. He did not analyze them. He simply let them be and go like shadows on the wall. He understood. Suffering arises where we make the fleeting eternal. And the eternal in us, perhaps, is only silence. He noticed how the internal monologues disappeared. There was no longer a need to talk to himself, to convince, to explain, to argue. He did not ask questions, and so the answers began to come without words. Through the smell of rain, through a warm palm, through the silence in the eyes of another. He didn't feel enlightened, not great, not awakened. Those were words from another world, a world where everything had to be named. Here, where he lived now, there was no need for labels. There was only this, to live, not for something, not against something, just like that. Sometimes he walked in a crowd and felt himself dissolving, how the boundary between he and everyone was lost. Not in euphoria, but in peace. He was a tree among trees, a shadow among shadows, a sound in the general breathing of the street. And in this dissolution there was an unexpected warmth, unconditional acceptance. He stopped waiting. Any expectations became knots in the flow. And now he knew, the fewer knots, the purer the flow. He drank water, just water. He stroked the dog, just like that. He looked at the sky, not looking for signs. He no longer tried to fill each moment with meaning, and so each moment became alive. In the evening, he lay down and did not think about what he had done during the day. He did not sum it up. He did not regret. He had no desire to live through anything again, no aspiration to repeat it. Everything happened as it should, and disappeared, leaving no trace. And when he closed his eyes, there were no dreams. There was emptiness, pure, warm, boundless, like the breath of someone who does not need a name. The next morning brought no changes, and that was its perfection. Everything remained in its place: the cup, the light, the shadow of the window frame. But he looked differently, not from himself, but through himself, as if his eyes were simply apertures through which the world entered and exited without encountering an obstacle. He ceased to be the center. He felt more and more like a field in which events happen. He no longer said, "I have decided," because decisions came like rain, without reason, without effort in their own time. He walked slowly. Not because he was tired, but because there was nowhere else to hurry. There was no finish line, no achievement. Each step was a completion in itself. Each pause was already filled enough. He noticed that he was becoming less memorable. People stopped looking for something recognizable in him. He became neutral, transparent, like the air between words. And it didn't hurt. It was liberating. He no longer carried expectations, either his own or others. When someone pushed him in the store without apologizing, he didn't feel offended. It was just a movement, not addressed, not personal, like the wind that doesn't blow at you, but just blows. He did not seek joy, but it came, in the form of the sun's reflection in a puddle, in the look of a cat lazily stepping over the threshold, in the silence when no one calls, writes, or waits. This joy did not belong to him. It simply arose like the air in the morning forest. Sometimes he looked at his hands, at the wrinkles, at the traces of time, and felt no attraction to the body. He knew that these were clothes, temporary, moderately comfortable, but not him. And if the day came when they no longer fit, he would leave easily, like throwing off a cloak on the threshold of sleep. He no longer lived from event to event. He lived between them, in the gaps, in what always seemed empty. And now it was in these gaps that he found the most alive, the most real. He didn't know how much longer he would have to walk. He didn't know where the path ended, and he didn't ask himself that question, because maybe the path itself is him. He walked along the river where the water flowed slowly, almost imperceptibly, like him, not from somewhere, not to somewhere, but simply through. The waters did not know his name, did not reflect his face, but accepted. And in this silent reception there was more kinship than in 100 conversations. He did not feel cut off from the world. On the contrary, everything became a part of him, and he became a part of everything. When the wind touched the leaves, he felt it in himself. When a bird screamed, its voice seemed to be born in his chest. Everything became a single body, not his, not someone else's, just a body. One day he stopped at a wall where someone had written, "Be yourself." He read it and smiled, not because he was arguing, but because he understood. It is impossible not to be yourself, but you is not a fixed entity. It is all that is now, including silence, doubt, disappearance. He remembered how he had once tried to find his essence. He had written, searched, spoken, argued, suffered. All of this was necessary. All of this was part of the path. But now the search had dissolved, not because he had found it, but because he had realized there was nothing hidden. He no longer felt separate from time. The seconds flowed through him like water through his fingers. He didn't catch them. He didn't store them. He didn't divide them into good and bad. They just were, like the breath of a dream in which there was no longer a dreamer, only a dream. When people approached him, he listened, really, without trying to answer, correct, add, because he understood the most valuable thing is to be there without interfering, just to be, like an open window. He hardly spoke about himself, not because he was hiding, but because there was nothing to protect. He became like a shadow walking next to the body, not needing recognition, but always present. And one day he looked up at the sky, not to find a sign, not to ask a question, but simply because there was no reason not to look. And in this look, full of nothing, everything was suddenly reflected. One day he noticed that he had not asked himself the question for a long time. Am I living correctly? It wasn't a result of a revelation. The question itself simply became alien, like an object left in a house where you no longer live. He began to feel the space around him becoming softer, as if the world had ceased to be a decoration, but had become a living body, not resisting, not hostile, not demanding. He did not seek to master it, change it, or explain it. He simply lived in it, as part of his pulse, as a line not torn from a book. Passing by the mirror, he sometimes stopped, not out of interest, not out of habit, just to look, not at himself, but at the one reflected there, without the desire to know who he was, without hope for an answer, just to remind himself, everything moves, everything goes away, everything remains. He listened to the rain and did not look for meaning in it. Meaning became an unnecessary intermediary. All that is already enough. Without translation, without form, without construction, like looking at fire, like holding a hand on the chest and feeling the beating that does not require words. When someone asked him to tell about himself, he would begin to speak, not from memory, but as if for the first time. Each time, a different story, a different version, a different accent. And it was all true, not a single one, not complete, but each one real in the way it sounded here and now. He no longer sought to be understood. Understood becomes frozen, and he chose to remain fluid, elusive even to himself. He did not hide. He simply did not cling, and yet there was a warmth in him, deep, unhurried, silent, like a fire that no longer burns but warms. He did not shine for anyone to see. He simply was, and that was enough to make the presence of others quieter. One day, passing by an old tree, he placed his palm on the bark, not to feel life, but to allow himself to be without boundaries. And in that moment, he understood. The tree does not know who he is. The wind does not know where he comes from. And he himself no longer needs this knowledge. He left, not from the world, from the need to be in the center of the world. Only life remained, not as a path, but as a field, without direction, without purpose, without form, a field that breathes. And in this breath, he walked through a city where no one knew his name. And that was freedom. No expectations, no stories to follow. Just steps, just air, just faces to pass by without bearing reflections. Sometimes he felt the world becoming transparent. Buildings were like dreams, people were like thoughts, and he himself was like the shadow of a cloud on the water. Everything existed, but nothing held. Everything real was elusive. He wasn't looking for solitude, but he wasn't looking for presence either. He was as calm in a crowd as he was in an empty room, because the main thing he had been looking for before, to be himself, was no longer a task. Now it just happened, without effort, without desire. He increasingly noticed that he could be next to another person and not disappear, not shrink into a role, not become convenient. He did not prove, did not save, did not inspire. He simply was, and this was enough for it to become quieter next to him. There was no longer a need to change the world. He no longer thought he knew how things should be. He simply met everything as it was and moved on. Not because he was indifferent, but because he had learned to trust what was happening. Without a fight, without a takeover. When he entered the forest, the trees did not ask why he had come. They did not make him better or demand an answer. And he did not expect anything either. He simply walked among the trunks, smelled the earth, and knew. He was not a guest, not an observer, not a witness. He was a part. He began to forget his old beliefs, not because they were false, but because they had become unnecessary, like a ladder that you leave behind when you are already on the ground. And in these days where there were no achievements, no victories, no attempts, he found silence, not as emptiness, but as a depth that has no bottom, a silence in which one can be without looking back, without waiting for the end, without remembering the beginning. He didn't disappear. He didn't become someone new. He simply stopped being everything he tried to be and remained something that never began or ended. Simple, alive, infinitely real. He sat by the water where the ripples slowly spread from the stone as if time itself were exhaling. No thoughts to finish, no feelings to name. Everything was just happening, and everything was already finished. Sometimes memories rose up in him like a light mist. Faces, places, choices, lives he had lived inside himself. But now they were no more important than the breath of the wind on his skin. He did not grasp at them. He knew that even the most vivid memories could not hold on to the present, and the present did not need to be protected. He no longer felt like a man with a story. The story had disappeared. All that remained was the frame, each time a new one. It was a look without a viewer, a movement without a purpose, a pause between words that turned out to be the most alive. He noticed how many around him were trying to be someone, how everything was screaming to be noticed. And he, on the contrary, became quieter, not from fatigue, but from being overweight, as if there was nothing more to add to him, no name, no feat, no justification. When someone spoke about the meaning of life, he was silent, not because he did not know the answer, but because he knew. Life does not ask for meaning, just as breathing does not ask for a name. It simply happens, and this is already enough to be. He wasn't waiting for the turn anymore. He wasn't waiting for the final chapter. He realized that the story he was living had no structure, no moral. It wasn't a book, but music without a score. Sometimes loud, sometimes quiet, but always real. He didn't know what to call this state, but words were no longer necessary. He was like a morning in which things hadn't started yet, like the sky before the first ray of light, like a room in which nothing was happening. But it was in this nothing that everything began. And perhaps this was his last role, to be the one who no longer plays. Not because the scene is over, because he is the space in which everything unfolds. And everything has already happened. He continued to live as if the very idea of a center had disappeared. He was not in the middle of the world, but the world had become whole without a center. Everything moved, everything met, everything left. And in this movement, there was no main thing. There was no need to stand in focus. He allowed himself to become a background, and this turned out to be infinitely soft. Sometimes he watched someone argue, trying to be right, defending their own. He didn't judge. He just remembered how it felt to be reduced to an image that needed to be constantly confirmed. Now he knew that when you don't defend the form, everything can enter you. He noticed how fear had disappeared, not as something defeated, but as a shadow that had lost its source. He did not think about the future. He did not look for it. Tomorrow became as transparent as yesterday. Time was no longer a road. It became space. He walked through the days like water through light. He no longer needed a name, even for himself. He knew that every eye would eventually shrink, and he wanted to remain open, not endless, just without edge, without the need to be something. He stopped clinging even to silence, because he understood, if you cling to silence, you are searching again. He simply was, sometimes in noise, sometimes in emptiness, sometimes in the touch of someone else's gaze. And it was all the same, life, without a name. He began to listen, not with his ears, but with his whole body, to hear the street flow, the air breathe, the pause in someone's sentence break. He didn't look for a message, didn't grasp for meaning. He simply allowed himself to be open to the sound, like a tree to the wind. One day he stood by the shore and saw his reflection. But he didn't recognize himself. The face was familiar, but not defining. He looked not into the depths, but through. And for the first time he understood. To be means not to be someone. To be means not to interfere. And then, for the first time, he truly felt he was neither before nor after. Was not this body, was not this look. It was the place where everything happened, and nothing more. And less is also nothing. He slowly walked away from the shore, leaving no trace. The water closed behind him as if he had never been there. And that was the truth. Not the tragedy of disappearance, but the ease of dissolution. He no longer looked for himself in reflections, in words, in memories. Everything that had seemed important before became transparent. It did not disappear, but simply ceased to be the center. He did not become different. He ceased to be who he thought he was. Now every movement was complete. Every look was finished. Not because something had been achieved, but because nothing required continuation. There was no need to become. All that was left was to be. He walked, and the world did not wait for an answer from him. The birds did not ask who he was. The stones did not seek his name. The wind did not distinguish him from the air. And he himself no longer divided. He was, without effort, without a name, without a boundary between himself and everything else. And that was enough forever.